Within the geography of ancient Rome, there are few representations of the ancient city's concept of peace with more tangible significance than the temple dedicated to the god Janus, or Janus. This temple was at the center of a unique symbolic tradition that deeply encapsulates how the ancient Romans would have envisioned the transition from wartime to peacetime. Firstly, some background information. Janus was a Roman god presiding over change, portals, thresholds, beginnings, endings, and the like. To reflect these purposes, he was usually depicted as having two faces looking in opposite directions, one looking into the past and the other looking into the future. The month of January is named after him, as it represented the transition from the old year to the new. Janus was worshipped at a temple erected in the Roman Forum, the center of public life in ancient Rome, along the Via Sacra. According to Livy and Plutarch, the temple was built by the order of Numa Pompilius, the legendary second king of Rome who succeeded Romulus. According to a tradition introduced by Numa, the gates of the temple were to be kept open in times of war and shut during times of peace. Now, knowing how very warlike Roman civilization was, one would naturally expect the temple gates to have been kept open for the vast majority of the time, and such an assumption would be correct. One of the primary sources for this tradition is On the Latin Language by Marcus Terentius Varro, in which the author emphasizes how rare it was for the gates to be closed. He claims that the gates had only been closed 2 times in all of the temple's history at the time of his writing, that is, the mid-1st century BC. The first time was shortly after the temple was built, during the reign of Numa, which is traditionally recorded as being an unusually peaceful time within Roman memory. The second time happened during the consulship of Titus Manlius Torquatus, which was shortly after Rome had claimed victory in the First Punic War by driving the Carthaginians out of Sicily. The other sources for this tradition are the previously mentioned Livy and Plutarch, who were both writing decades later, during the Principate established by Augustus. They both parrot Varro and give the tenures of Numa and Titus as the times that the gates were closed, but they also add a third instance to the list, the reign of Augustus, the inception of the so-called Pax Romana. Outside of these historians, the last source that exists for the tradition of the gates, and also the latest chronologically, is the Res Gestae Divi Augusti, the inscription situated outside of Augustus's tomb. Written in the first person, the 13th point of the Res Gestae list has Augustus acknowledge the rarity of the shutting of the gates before proclaiming that, during his reign, he ordered the gates to be shut on 3 separate occasions, after he had secured peace throughout Roman territory. Now, the Res Gestae is not a comprehensive list of all of Augustus's deeds, rather it's an autobiography that was very carefully tailored. The emperor's choice to include the closing of the gates among his account speaks volumes to the tradition's importance within Roman culture. Now, there has been a significant amount of published scholarship discussing the tradition of the Temple of Janus, and with a variety of focuses and lenses as well. There have been many articles and essays written about the archaeology of the temple, the history of the worship of Janus and how the tradition connects to earlier iterations of the god, about analyzing the intentions of the leaders who ordered the gates to be closed, and examining the authorship of the primary literary sources and what Varro, Livy, etc. were attempting to convey to their primary audiences. Such analyses are certainly useful for the purposes of understanding ancient visualizations of peace. For example, it can be examined how the chroniclers of Augustus, and the emperor himself, were attempting to associate Augustus and his partaking in the tradition of the gates with the famously peaceful reign of Numa. However, there has been a lack of comprehensive analysis of the tradition and its relationship with ancient Roman cultural visualizations of peace as a whole. That is something that's been mostly unexplored, and thus there is a lot of room for analysis of what the tradition of the temple can reveal about Roman attitudes towards peace building. There are many directions that such a more focused study could take. The most important direction, in my opinion, that studying the Temple of Janus can go is analyzing it as a cautionary tale for the dangers of victory ceremonies and peace celebrations. Augustus and his predecessors used the ceremony of the gates as a very simple symbol to send a message that all was well. Rome's enemies had been crushed and a golden age had begun. As I'm sure everyone has been learning about in great detail over the course of this module, peace building is not so simple. It is an incredibly complicated affair, not something that can be simply turned on when the time is right, as easy as flipping on a light switch or closing a gate. Compressing something so complex into a simple public ceremony which is something that can still be seen happening in the modern day, can work to devolve peace building into a very uninvolved process in the minds of the people, which leads to pieces that are not built to last. Another potential angle is looking closer at how intensely the tradition of the gates was associated with military victories. All of the recorded closings of the gates followed the conclusions of lengthy conflicts. Numa's establishment of the tradition came after the apocryphal reign of Romulus, which is traditionally recorded as involving wars against the Sabines and the Etruscans. Livy even calls attention to this in a unique way, saying that Rome was founded twice, once by Romulus through war, and once by Numa through peace. Moving on, Titus Manlius had ordered the gates shut after Rome had taken control of Sicily by defeating Carthage, and Augustus had done the same after concluding the civil war between himself and Mark Antony with his victory at the Battle of Actium. Now, what this trend suggests is that the Romans saw peace, or at least the leaders that controlled the tradition of the gates wanted peace to be seen, less as something to be desired, something to be maintained in avoidance of the destruction of war, and rather as a consequence of victory. Peace would only exist for the Roman people when all of the city's enemies were either dead or in chains. Additionally, being that the decision to close the gates rested in the hands of a king, a consul, or an emperor, the implication given was that peace is something that comes about through the actions of a strong and powerful leader. Another problem that comes with the tradition is that Augustus's reign, despite being known as the start of the Pax Romana, was not free of war. War continued to be waged in Gaul, Spain, and Egypt, both putting down revolts and preparing for expansions of Roman territory, while Augustus was publicly declaring the empire to be at peace. Of course, Augustus's purpose wasn't to build real peace, but to suggest the image of a peaceful existence to his subjects. And since Augustus's wars were being waged far beyond the boundaries of the city of Rome itself, it would have been rather simple to keep those wars out of sight and out of mind, especially to a populace that was so weary of many decades of civil war, with a religious ceremony that declared to all that there was no more war. To conclude, the tradition of the Temple of Janus is an incredibly unique and stark facet of ancient peace building, and I was rather surprised by how little had been done with it from the angle of peace and war, given to how straightforward it seems to be. It's rare to find an element of history that is as tangible as this fusion of religious architecture and war and peace symbolism, and there is a lot of untapped potential for scholarship within it. That is all. Thank you for listening.